And hopefully everyone can see that. I'm assuming
Good
it's
on
my
my
title
end.
page. Okay, great. Perfect. So yeah, thanks again for having me. And like Scott said, I want to talk a little bit about manageability. Um, I want to first sort of have a conversation about getting ready for the season because it's the start of the season. There's snow in a lot of places. And I want to talk about using our avalanche forecast to help us better plan and then just being cognizant of the vocabulary that we use as we plan our days. Um, so, you know, the backcountry can be just such a rewarding place, so exciting, and such a great place to connect with people and be in wild places. I feel like it can also be kind of overwhelming because of all the variables that we're supposed to be paying attention to. And I'm assuming, like most of you, the first thing that I do when I'm getting ready to go out into the backcountry for a day is that I navigate to the Forecast Center website. And in the Northwest, I'm going to choose the zone that I'm going to travel in for the day. And then I'm going to spend some time digging into the information. And I'm looking at the weather, I'm looking to see if there's been any avalanches. And there's also just a lot of vocabulary that I'm tuning into. And some of the vocabulary that jumps out in all the forecast centers across the US is we'll see an avalanche hazard rating that we need to pay attention to. There's also this discussion about current avalanche problems. And then somewhere woven into the text of a forecast, there's typically travel advice. And I want to dig a little bit into this before I talk about the manageability of avalanche problems. And some of you may have seen me speak in the past, and some of this might be review, but for me, exploring vocabulary and language and Avalanche Forecast Center pages is really important for the start of the season. So hopefully this is a good jump into the winter. And the first thing I want to do is just dig into the vocabulary or the language around risk and how we can use it as backcountry travelers. And a couple definitions to start off with. I want to differentiate between hazard and risk. And hazard is an agent that has the potential to cause harm. And hazard can exist without anything being inserted into that hazard. So the hazard can just exist out in space and time. In order to have risk, you need to have something that's at risk. And risk, the sort of textbook definition is it measures the likelihood of harm from a hazard. And so translating this into our world of snow and avalanches, we look at the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale. And in this case, danger and hazard are used synonymously. So you'll hear people talk about the avalanche danger. You'll also hear people talk about the avalanche hazard. We're referencing the same thing. So this avalanche hazard can exist in the mountains without anything being inserted into it to be at risk. So that's a definition around hazard and where we see it in our world. And then as backcountry travelers, whenever we choose to go out into the mountains, we then need to start thinking about risk because that is what we're evaluating. And a simple definition of risk, and I've borrowed this from Grant Statham, he gave a great TED talk on risk, is the probability of loss or the probability of gain. And when we think about risk, so there's something at risk, but the first thing that we evaluate is this sort of likelihood and consequence equation that's on the left. When I think about risk, I'm trying to evaluate the likelihood of something happening, in our world, the likelihood of triggering an avalanche, and then the consequence for if that thing happens. So what happens if I trigger an avalanche here? That's what I'm constantly evaluating. And that likelihood and consequence, I can sort of evaluate outside of putting something specific in there, inserting a specific person or building or anything. What's the likelihood of an avalanche occurring and what's the consequence? And then when we dig deeper into risk, we do need to insert something into risk. And so I, of course, place my husband in this equation, which is not very nice of me. I need to work on that. But so likelihood and consequence. And then we're also, if we are facing risk, we're going to look at our vulnerability and our exposure. And so let's dig into these so that hopefully as you start traveling in the backcountry this winter, This becomes a vocabulary that you use with your group and everyone's on the same page. So first, talking about likelihood, and if you're an engineer, which I'm sure there are some of you out there that are, you might be thinking about likelihood or probability as a 0 or 1 equation, meaning 0, it's absolutely impossible that something is going to happen, and 1 is that it's certain that something is going to happen. But most of us, if we're not living in the world of engineering, are probably operating between those 0 and 1 places, right? We are living in uncertainty. And so when we're traveling in the backcountry, we're always trying to evaluate the level of uncertainty. And when I'm thinking about terrain that I'm going to choose to travel in on a given day, I want to feel pretty dang confident that the likelihood of triggering an avalanche is very low if I'm going to enter terrain that's highly consequential. And on the flip side, if I have a day where it seems highly likely that avalanches are going to be triggered, I might adjust my terrain selection to the opposite end of the spectrum and avoid avalanche terrain. So I start using the likelihood of triggering avalanches to begin to help me tour plan. And then the other piece that plays into that is the consequence. And depending on the terrain that I might choose to travel in, I want to understand the impact of something happening or an avalanche happening. So looking at the terrain here, if I get caught in an avalanche on most of this terrain, I'm carried over cliffs. And the consequence could be severe injury or it could be death. And there might be other pieces of the terrain where the consequence is much lower. So I'm constantly looking at that as well. There's some good comments of only digital engineers are evaluating this. The other piece around risk, so likelihood and consequence, and then we talked about vulnerability. And so in this case, you have this picture of this ice climber. And if the hazard that exists is an icefall hazard, this climber, if they're climbing with no rope and just soloing, they're quite vulnerable to the impact of that hazard, right? If an ice chunk falls and hits this climber, the consequence could be quite severe. And this climber can manage their vulnerability or change their vulnerability by putting a rope on. Other ways that we manage vulnerability traveling in the backcountry, it might be by wearing a helmet or wearing an airbag. When we're driving a car, it might be by wearing our seatbelts. And so if we manage our vulnerability to a hazard, we can change our risk equation. And the other piece that I think about a lot is exposure. And when I think about exposure in the world of snow and avalanches, I honestly mainly think about terrain selection, because my terrain selection is basically the gas pedal of risk, right? The bigger the terrain I am, the more exposed I am to a given avalanche problem. And so then the higher my risk might be. And so looking at this particular skier, they are right in the middle of a big avalanche path or a sizable avalanche path. And so they're fully exposed. So I might shift my exposure by choosing lower angle terrain. I might shift aspects if I'm concerned about a specific avalanche problem. I might, if I'm an investor, I might shift my exposure by diversifying my investments. So there's a few ways to manage our exposure. But in general, when I'm starting to think about traveling in the backcountry for a day, the conversations I'm having with my partners are constantly around risk. What's the likelihood of something happening? What's the consequence of that if we trigger an avalanche here? How vulnerable are we to the avalanche hazard right here? And can we change our vulnerability? And how exposed are we? And then let's overlay a little bit more vocabulary, because the other thing that your forecasters are constantly talking about are the avalanche problems and what avalanche problems are present for the given day and where they are. And so the avalanche forecasters every day are amazing. And they're trying to have a conversation about risk with you every day when they're putting out a forecast. This is an example of what's called the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. And this is basically a flow chart to demonstrate some of the thought process that forecasters are going through each day as they put out an avalanche hazard rating, and as well as they just put out their general avalanche forecast for the day. And oftentimes forecasters, the first thing they're going to do is identify what avalanche problems are present on a given day. And it might be through looking at weather forecasts, through looking at reports that you all have sent in, through field reports that they have had. but they're going to identify what avalanche problems might be present for the day and where those avalanche problems are. And then they're going to dig deeper and look at how sensitive to triggering these avalanches are and how widely distributed they are. And what I mean by spatial distribution or how widely distributed they are is some avalanche problems are found on all aspects and all elevations sometimes. And then other avalanche problems might exist only on upper elevation north facing slopes. And that distribution can influence the likelihood of someone triggering an avalanche. Because if they're more widely distributed, you're more likely to find that avalanche problem and potentially trigger it. So that's how the forecasters are getting to that formula of the likelihood of triggering an avalanche. And then when we talk about consequence, our sort of substitute, and it's not a perfect substitute, is to talk about the size of an avalanche. And we talk about this destructive size. And basically our scale goes from D1 to D5. And the bigger the number, the bigger the avalanche. And D2 is big enough to bury or injure a person or kill a person. And D5 shapes the landscape. So you get a sense of the scale. So what I've done with this graph, and I've borrowed it from quite a few people, is just sort of overlay all of these concepts. I had a great conversation with Dallas Glass, and this illustration is not perfect. In real life, the lines between low and moderate and considerable and high are not straight lines. So don't take this as absolute. But I think it's a really interesting illustration of how a forecaster might get to a specific rating, where the probability of triggering an avalanche, they're going to look at that. And so perhaps the probability of triggering an avalanche is likely, and the size of that avalanche is a D2 avalanche, so big enough to bury a person. Well, that might be how they get to that moderate avalanche hazard rating for the day. And then they're going to overlay that avalanche problem. So perhaps something that's likely to be triggered and D1 to D2 might be a storm slab or a wind slab avalanche problem. We might also have a moderate hazard rating because we have a persistent slab problem that is unlikely that we'll trigger it, but if we do, it's a much larger avalanche, so potentially a higher consequence. So this is sort of how this all interplays. So the avalanche hazard or the avalanche danger exists, and then as we insert ourselves into this, we're facing risk. So how do we evaluate that risk? And when I put that risk equation together, my hazard rating might be moderate, but my risk for the day is quite different if I choose to operate in terrain like this than if I choose to operate in terrain like this. I'm much more vulnerable to any of these hazards, to hazard of avalanches or icefall in this terrain, and I am 100% exposed in this terrain. And in this terrain, I can shift that vulnerability and exposure and reduce my risk equation. So when I navigate to the Forecast Center website and I'm faced with a day like this, and thank you, Dallas, who grabbed some forecasts for me, I have a considerable avalanche hazard rating at all elevations. My two avalanche problems for the day, one is a persistent slab where the likelihood of triggering it is likely. And that to me, a 3 on a scale of 5 gives me pause. I pay a lot of attention to that. And the size of the avalanche is very large and it's on all aspects and elevations. That makes me pay attention. And then I have a wind slab problem that's likely that I might trigger it, D2, and on all aspects at mid and upper elevations. This begins to force my terrain planning hand. So I might gather the information just by looking at these graphics. As an avalanche professional, what I do is I have these morning sheets that I fill out, and I'm looking at the exact same thing. I might be actually writing it down versus on a recreational day, maybe I don't take the time to write all these things down. But what I'm looking at is, have there been any significant changes in weather for the day? Has there been significant loading from wind or snow or rain? Has there been significant temperature changes? Has there been any recent avalanche activity? And then I'm going to take the time to map out those avalanche problems. And I might use the Forecast Center to tell me what the problems are and where they are. Or I might use my operational experience or the knowledge that comes from my operation. And this is where I start thinking about what terrain I want to travel in, because my job as a backcountry traveler is to be an avalanche avoider. Ski patrollers go out and they hunt avalanches because they want to mitigate the terrain so they can open up the ski area. But as a backcountry traveler, my job is to be an avalanche avoider. And so if I'm noticing that there is a persistent slab problem on all aspects and all elevations, then my job is to choose lower angle terrain that's not avalanche terrain. But it might be something else and I can choose different terrain. But either way, I'm going to take the time to just go through that risk analysis. What's the likelihood of triggering an avalanche today? And what would be the consequence in terrain that we're thinking about traveling in? And then at this point is when I put that terrain overlay on it. And this is when I'm going to start thinking about where I want to travel for the day, keeping in mind that terrain is my gas pedal of risk and that my job is to avoid avalanches. So really what I think about when I'm trying to choose terrain for the day, I'm not saying don't ever go into avalanche terrain, but I am saying choose terrain for the day that offers you some margin. And when I think about margin, I think about room to make errors. If you're running in low margin terrain or low margin conditions, one error, one small mistake could lead to catastrophic failure, could lead to death or injury because of an avalanche. So I often try and plan tours where I have bigger margins. And if I don't, my partners and I need to be aware that we are traveling on a day where we have very little margin for error. And then this is where that conversation around manageability comes in. I work for a variety of guide services. I'm on the board of our Avalanche Center Foundation group. And what has happened in the last 5 to 10 years is we've moved from just talking about avalanche hazard or the avalanche danger. We've introduced avalanche problems and this conversation around risk. And now what I'm hearing my peers and other guide services talk about is they identify the avalanche problems for the day, the terrain they might be traveling in, and then there's this conversation around manageability. Is something manageable? And when I think about manageability with avalanche problems, I think about a few things. I think about our ability to recognize and identify an avalanche problem if it's present in the terrain we might be traveling in. And I also think about our ability to escape an avalanche if we trigger it in that terrain. And that is this conversation that I want to peel apart a little bit because I feel like we aren't being as accurate in our vocabulary and our assessment as maybe we should be. So this conversation about risk, I'm going to just keep coming back to this because I think it's so important. What's the likelihood of triggering an avalanche? What's the consequence? We take the time to identify what avalanche problems are present. And then in these guide operations that I work for, that's where manageability comes in. And Dallas and I had a great conversation about this, of thinking about manageability sort of on this sliding scale. And it's not that any given problem is always less manageable or more manageable, but depending on a variety of variables, things land on this scale at different places. But if I had to generalize, I would put persistent slab problems and deep slab avalanche problems in the less manageable side, and storm slab avalanche problems in the more manageable side. And you'll see at the top, my title says manageability in avalanche terrain, right? Our number one management tool, and I'll say this again, is really our terrain selection. And so we can manage any of these problems just by avoiding avalanche terrain. But if we're choosing to enter avalanche terrain, recognizing that these persistent slab or deep slab problems are probably actually not manageable, I think is a worthy thing to talk about. And I find these little PDFs really interesting. These are this like avalanche problem toolbox, and we have a link to this in the blog from the Utah Avalanche Center. There's a write-up on all the different avalanche problems. The graphics might look different because different centers use different graphics. But what I really appreciate about this is this toolbox breaks down each avalanche problem. So the persistent slab, it defines exactly what it means. So if you're newer to the backcountry, this can be really useful in terms of understanding what your forecasters are saying to you. There's this travel advice piece. And oftentimes if you see the exclamation point in the bottom corner of the avalanche problem, that means in general, avoid avalanche terrain or choose lower angle terrain. But what I find really interesting is these bottom 3 boxes. And this is really how I think about manageability. And I really appreciated how this broke it down. So talking about and thinking about avalanche behavior, thinking about the ability to remote trigger an avalanche problem, and then thinking about our tests and observations and how reliable or unreliable they might be with a given problem. I'm going to just use two examples right now, but if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to navigate to that link because it breaks all of these down. And with deep slab avalanche problems, you can see with avalanche behavior, it's defined as unpredictable. And what that means, and what, if you talk to any forecasters or folks who've been in and around avalanche terrain for a long time, it's really hard to say where a deep or a persistent slab avalanche problem is going to be triggered. And sometimes it breaks out above you. Again, it's just hard to forecast for, which is why for me, it makes it less manageable and it increases my uncertainty. The other thing about deep slabs and persistent slabs is that the likelihood to remotely trigger these avalanche problems increases. And what we mean by remote triggers is you might be in the flats away from the steep part of the slope at the bottom, but you can actually impact a buried weak layer and bring an avalanche down on top of you, which again, you don't want to do. You don't want to kick the legs out from under the table. And then with deep and persistent slabs, if we're going out and using our powers of observation and our stability tests, they actually don't give us that useful of information. A lot of our stability tests are good for the top 75 centimeters of snow, the top meter of snow, so the top 2 or 3 feet of snow. And oftentimes that deep slab or persistent slab problem is buried even deeper. So this to me is a definition of an unmanageable avalanche problem if I'm going to enter avalanche terrain. If I flip it, storm slab problem, more often the behavior of storm slabs is predictable. That slab is less cohesive, so it tends to fracture closer to people's feet rather than above them. It's unlikely or lower likelihood that you're going to trigger these slabs remotely. And going out in the field, our stability tests and our observations give us more reliable data. Right? With all of this, our stability tests never trump, avalanche observations, cracking and collapsing always overrule any sort of stability test. So if you see avalanche activity, that's all the data that you need. But in terms of manageability, I really like this breakdown of avalanche behavior, remote triggers, and tests and observations. And again, I want to think about if you're using the word manageable or manageability, think of it as a sliding scale and recognize that there's a variety of variables that influence the manageability of a given avalanche problem on a given day. And some of those factors include the depth of the slab and or the depth of the weak layer, because the bigger the slab, the thicker the slab, the more likely it is that it's going to be hard to escape or it's going to be less manageable. The sensitivity of the snow, the more sensitive the snow, the more likely you are to trigger avalanches, which potentially makes an avalanche less manageable. And then terrain is really something I look at with manageability. And I think about the size of the terrain. So the bigger the terrain, the less likely I am going to be able to manage even a small to medium size avalanche. And then the consequence of the terrain, steep technical terrain where there's no escape routes, is much less manageable than lower angle, wider open terrain. So while anytime I see persistent slab avalanche problem on the forecast or deep persistent slab avalanche problem on the forecast, that really gets my attention and sort of raises that red flag of we have an unmanageable avalanche problem in terms of managing it in avalanche terrain. So my main management tool is now avoiding avalanche terrain. But you all get these storms where a storm slab avalanche problem might be waist deep as well. And there might be days where a storm slab problem, while I said it was often manageable, there might be days where that's not manageable as well. And so I think a lot about, that depth of snow can influence the manageability. And then my terrain selection, this is, like we said before, our gas pedal of risk. And so this manageability, my terrain selection can influence the manageability of an avalanche problem. I might have a shallow wind slab problem, 6, 8 inches deep. That wind slab problem might be manageable by skiing, moving on terrain, skiing out of it in this terrain on the left over here, these sort of wider open slopes. That same avalanche problem might be completely unmanageable in these couloirs that we're seeing on the right. So terrain can really influence the manageability of the problem today. So again, coming back to visit this same picture, even a 6 or 8 inch wind slab problem is not manageable in terrain like this, whereas it can be quite manageable in terrain like this. It might even be manageable in bigger terrain, but it depends on the avalanche problem and the given conditions for the day. And one of the things I've been talking to a lot of friends about, and I talked to Dallas about it, is where does wind slab fit in this spectrum? How manageable is wind slab? And oftentimes in the guide services that I work for in the Tetons, there's this conversation about wind slab being manageable. And I have a different perspective because I was caught in a shallow wind slab in terrain that was higher consequence, and I was carried 1,600 vertical feet. So when I think about wind slab, I don't think that it is often a manageable avalanche problem. So I've been asking this question, and I would love for y'all to keep pondering this, of why do wind slabs catch so many pros, so many experienced people, so many recreationists, so many of us? And I think in part, wind slabs are highly variable. So they don't fit in one bucket of a manageable avalanche problem or not a manageable avalanche problem. Sometimes wind slabs are really thick and really stiff, and they're basically not a manageable avalanche problem. Whereas other times, wind slabs are really thin and really soft, and they might be more manageable. So we can't generalize. We need to spend time studying what the Forecast Center is saying on a given day. I also think that we overestimate our ability to escape an avalanche or manage the avalanche problem. And when I think about this, basically, we think we're better than we are. So it's worth thinking about that. And I also think we don't necessarily understand the true definition of manageability. And what I mean by that is we're all avalanche avoiders, right? As backcountry travelers. So we don't have that much experience managing avalanches. We don't see that many avalanches. So really understanding what's manageable and what's not is hard to evaluate as a recreationist because we don't have that much experience with them. So I don't want to just sort of stand here on my soapbox and rant, but I want us to all keep in mind that the world of snow and avalanches is a wicked learning environment. And we don't always get good feedback of if we made good decisions or we just got away with something. So there's a few things that I would challenge all of us to do during this season and as we start this season. First, I want you to talk to people who've been caught in avalanches to begin to understand what might be manageable and what might not be. And these are just a few prompts, but really start understanding what happens if people get caught in an avalanche and how shallow the avalanche has to be to become unmanageable. How quickly did it happen? Was there time to react? What was the avalanche problem? Explore that so that if you don't have to trigger lots of avalanches to gain experience, you can gain it through stories. I would challenge everyone to be humble. Learn from your mistakes, from your experiences, from others' mistakes, and recognize that most of us are not as good as we want to be or as we think we are. So strive to be realistic on what really is manageable. I would encourage you all to approach terrain in a lifelong aspect versus a lifelong viewpoint versus a seasonal viewpoint or a daily viewpoint, and find terrain that you can dip your toe into first before you jump into bigger terrain. And having a seasonal view or actually just a lifelong view of like, well, I guess this year isn't the year I'm going to ski that might be really helpful. And really what I look at is, can I access smaller pieces of terrain to assess before jumping into bigger lines? And then that dovetails nicely into just thinking about margin and building it in wherever you can. And sometimes that looks like traveling in smaller terrain, and sometimes that looks like avoiding avalanche paths completely. So hopefully this is a good refresher on the vocabulary of risk and thinking about risk, and also just a challenge around how we talk about avalanche problems and how we use them to help us plan tours for the day. And I would encourage you to utilize vocabulary or common language around risk with your ski partners. I think it makes for a much better educated conversation. Keep in mind that terrain is your gas pedal of risk and your brake of risk, right? If you ever have questions or you're overwhelmed, terrain is your answer. And take the time to learn from yourself and learn from others so that hopefully we can better understand what risks we might actually be taking in the backcountry. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. There's so many good things in there. I don't even know where to begin. And for those of you that have questions, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. That'll be a little easier for us to manage it. And Sarah, and I think it's a really good reminder. I just love the concept of brushing up on the backcountry Avalanche lexicon every fall. This is a good time to start, doing refreshers and thinking about how it is we communicate with our partners. One question coming in from someone is curious if manageability is part of your AAI curriculum that you teach.
It comes up in conversations more on the pro side of courses. It's not I would say we talk about avalanche problems that raise red flags and push us into more conservative terrain versus avalanche problems that might be things that we can navigate through. We haven't come up with a great, perfectly formatted conversation around manageability. So we would love more input on it, because I would love to make it a more formalized piece. I do talk about it in the pro courses that I work on. Yeah.
Yeah. And, the other thing that I thought, I love the concept of the likelihood consequence piece and kind of looking at that on both sides. I've always approached going out in the backcountry thinking in terms of likelihood and consequences, this kind of iterative process that you're evaluating, as you move through, terrain, and kind of like you mentioned, your terrain selection is kind of that gas pedal of risk. And I'm wondering, if you have any core concrete, pro tips that you might have for our listeners and viewers, that they could take away with them around, thinking about how do you look at likelihood of being caught in an avalanche, and how do you evaluate that consequence? Obviously, I think there's some really clear, kind of black and white scenarios, you can avoid avalanche terrain and then all of a sudden we don't have any avalanche risk, or you're gonna, you've got huge consequence or death consequence if you're in a no fall zone. But I'm curious if you could just kind of talk a little bit about what's going through your head when you're thinking about likelihood and consequence, and if there's just a few kernelized things you could leave people with.
Yeah, I find likelihood to be the hardest thing to
evaluate. Yeah, exactly.
It's so hard. And it's the same when you're driving on an icy road. It's what is the likelihood of me actually going off?
Right.
And I think if we haven't experienced being caught, we underestimate that likelihood of triggering an avalanche is one thing that I think. For me, when I think about likelihood and consequence, one thing that I look at is avalanche activity. Right. So if there's been a lot of avalanche activity on specific aspects, on specific elevations, then that to me is telling me that my likelihood of triggering an avalanche is actually pretty high. Right. Versus if there are very few avalanches or no avalanches, then again, you can sort of flip that. One thing I keep in mind though, is when you're looking at that, you might be looking at it in two different lenses. Sometimes you get the big storm and there's a ton of avalanches and you can watch the likelihood taper as the snowpack gets stronger.
Right.
There's some years where we have a persistent slab problem where there's no avalanches, there's no avalanches, there's no avalanches. And then there's one, and then there's two. And so for me, if I have a persistent slab avalanche problem or a deep slab avalanche problem, I'm looking more for the canary in the coal mine. So that there was a big avalanche, and that single avalanche is telling me that my likelihood is going up. And on the flip side, if I'm looking at a storm slab avalanche problem and sometimes a wind slab avalanche problem, I can track the likelihood on more of a downward trajectory. Does that make, hopefully that's sort of one thing that I think about.
Yeah, totally. I think tying it into just kind of hammering home the point of being aware of your situation and making observations and using recent, current and recent avalanche activity as as like really important inputs, you know,
Yeah.
understanding that likelihood, you know, at least trying to assemble a few more puzzle pieces in the complexity that is, you know, likelihood. So yeah,
Yeah,
no,
and
I
I
think
like
that's great.
I don't want to preach abstinence by any means because I love
Right.
skiing and avalanche terrain when it's appropriate. But
Totally.
I
Yeah.
also think like giving yourself margin. So like
Mhm.
the you need room to learn, especially as you're starting. So,
Mhm.
you know, the big names in your region might be skiing big terrain and you might be sticking to smaller terrain as you
Mhm.
start, but recognizing that you need a little room to be able to learn as well. So
Yeah,
that's
totally. You
something
got to get
else
in
to
the
think
swimming
about.
pool, learn to swim, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, you've got to get out there and get some experience, which reminded me, you know, one of the things I thought that was really very refreshing to see you call out wind slabs and just the challenges of wind slabs. That is of the handful of avalanches that I found myself caught and carried in, they happened to all be wind slabs. I find it a very challenging, you know, avalanche problem to manage.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a really awesome, refreshing thing to have you mention there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see there's maybe we have time for just one quick question here. On the theme of wind slabs, would you be willing to walk through a few of your own experiences with wind slab avalanches and you know, some highlights around how you were managing uh, you know, the hazard that day?
Yeah, I mean, the significant avalanche that I was caught and carried in was a wind slab avalanche problem.
Mhm.
One thing that played into my accident near miss is I was traveling with a partner who I really hadn't spent a lot of time with.
Mhm.
Very talented person in the mountains, but we just hadn't been ski partners. Another woman, I don't often get to ski with women in the backcountry and big terrain. So we headed straight for big terrain and neither
Mhm.
of us wanted to speak up and change the day. So we got to the top of a couloir. I jumped on it. I tried to trigger it, but this wind slab was more on the unmanageable. It was thin, but I couldn't trigger it from above, but I made 2 turns down in and the whole thing broke out above me.
Oh,
And so at
geez.
that point I was sort of in the meat and I thought I could get out. I almost escaped. And then more snow sort of came behind me and
Mhm.
carried me. And my lesson was, you know, this wind slab was maybe boot top at most. It wasn't big, but the terrain was such that it just took every piece of snow above me and funneled it right into me on top of me and just sent me down a place where I had one escape route. I almost got there. I didn't make it. And then I was just in the ride. And so for me, when I think about the manageability of avalanche problems and especially wind slabs, steep alpine terrain, 6 to 8 inches of a wind slab is no longer a manageable problem. So
Right.
that's sort of, you know, mine was definitely a human factor communication problem. I got
Mhm.
lucky, I survived. But it didn't take much of a wind slab to take me on a long,
Yeah.
scary ride.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing. That's
Yeah.
sounds like a scary story and
Yes.
a solid lessons all around, huh?
Yes.
Ugh.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely. Yeah.
thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to see you. I really enjoyed your presentation. Um, and I think, oh, and that you know, grants talk that you mentioned, I think is awesome. We'll drop that in the chat function. So thanks again.
Thanks for
Here's to a
having me.
great season and have a great year. Hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank
Yes.
you.